Thank you so much for coming here for our event today at York Festival of Ideas. My name is Eliza Hartrick. I'm a lecturer here at York in medieval history, and it's our pleasure to welcome you here today. And so that just leaves me to introduce to you Professor Janina Ramirez, who's a professor of medieval studies at University of Lincoln, senior research fellow at Harris Manchester College in Oxford, and an honorary research fellow here at York. And many of you will be familiar with Janina's many publications, including 6 books on medieval art, literature, history, archaeology. She really does it all. And in particular, you probably have seen her on television, on BBC, in Raiders of the Lost Past, numerous other documentaries, and on Radio 4. And today, Janina will be speaking to us about her book, Femina, A New History of the Middle Ages, with the women who've been written out of it. So we'll hear Janina speak, and then we'll have a short time for questions afterwards. So over to you.
Thank you, Eliza. That's really kind. Hello, it is an absolute joy to be back in my northern home of York. I was here for 7 years, a long time ago now, but have never really truly left, and every journey back is a pleasure. I must start off by reassuring you all the fact I have a very badly bloodshot eye and burnt skin is not because I've turned into a vampire over the last few weeks. I have had Lyme disease, I've been very, very poorly. I've been in bed for the last few weeks, so I have dragged myself out of bed, put on some makeup to be here with you today. Thank you very much. But I kind of think the burnt skin and eye thing looks a bit, like, suits the aesthetic, so I'm leaning into it. It is a joy to be here, and I've crafted the talk I want to give to you today around my deep love for the north of England, the sites around here that I got to know so well while I was a student and then a tutor here at the university, and some of the characters that sparked my passion for medieval studies that 20 years later I'm still getting excited about. So I am going to be talking about my book, which came out in paperback last year. It was an instant #1 bestseller. I know. Both myself and my publishing team are still picking our jaws up off the ground about this, because for a history book to do that is something. For a medieval history book about women that's quite obscure, and 1/3 of which is footnotes, is even weirder. So it was a real surprise, but I think the reason, I mean, I'm still working out the reason why it did what it did, but I think it's because people are ready to have these assumptions about both the medieval period, but also about the role of women across history, challenged to look at things differently. And as was very kindly said in the introduction, I am an interdisciplinary medievalist. This is a book that moves across scientific information, technology, archaeology, art history, literature. It's all in there in an attempt to challenge how we have been seeing women in the past. But I think it's still relevant now, because things haven't really changed. Do we have any Johns in the room today? No Johns? Johns are, oh, there's John. John, you are one of life's winners. There are more CEOs named John than there are women CEOs altogether. There are so many things we're still challenging. 108 years to close the gender pay gap. 20% of the world's landowners are women. This is a shocking one. 6 countries give women equal legal rights to write as men, and we're not one of them. So there are many, many things that we are still up against. And for me to begin to challenge these assumptions of where we find ourselves today, I went back to the period I love most, the medieval period. And just the year before my book came out, a friend of mine had written a big tome on the Anglo-Saxons. And in the beginning of this chapter, this introduction, he says, I'm writing a history book about the Anglo-Saxons. Unfortunately, I will not be including any women, because the women of the early medieval period are unrecoverable. Now, this was a bit of a red flag for me. I thought, are they really? I had written a book before Femina about the private lives of saints. And in that, I had covered Wilfred, Bede, Cuthbert, all our local friends. But I'd also managed to put in chapters about Bridget and about particularly Hilda. So I felt, hang on a minute, I think we can recover them, but what are our issues with why they might appear unrecoverable? Why might the historical documents make them seem unrecoverable? The more I thought of, oh gosh, I'm going way too far forward. Come on, Nina. There we go. The more I started to think about the sorts of women I wanted to find when I was writing my book, I didn't want it just to be what we do have a lot of, which are biographies of royals, noblewomen, people of the higher echelons of society. And of course, this is the way our history has been written for us, but also our archaeology, our art history, our objects, our paintings, our artefacts that we coo over when we go to museums and galleries tend to be produced by and for super rich people. And the records they leave behind are those that record the land holdings, the actions, the deeds of super rich people. To this day, I was surprised. I was making a documentary and I was filming the vellum making process. And there's one vellum maker left, and that's Wickham County, and they still make vellum. And I can open a vellum manuscript today and read it, even if it's 1,400 years old. Can we do that with floppy disks from 20 years ago? No, we can't, I discovered the other day. But I was shocked to find that this company is still doing a roaring trade because the landed gentry and the royal family still have their birth certificates, marriage certificates, death certificates, legal documents drawn up on vellum because they know that vellum will last. All of us, we get paper, if we're lucky. At the moment, we're just zeros and ones, I think. So the record is slanted in favour of evidence for higher class, upper class people. But that does not mean that if we look, we can't find people that are representative of other areas of society. So, for example, I'm writing my next book. You'll be pleased to know. You'll have to be getting your checkbooks out in about 6 months' time. Checkbooks? We don't have those anymore. Tupper phone. And in that book, I'm writing about people like Christine de Pizan. I'm writing about the Beguines. I'm going to share some of my latest research with you towards the end, but keep it quiet because my editor hasn't seen it yet. I'm thinking about the role of royals as patrons, but thinking about what they patronise. So in the case of Christine de Pizan, she sets up a publishing agency. She looks after her young family and her mother by writing popular books and becoming a kind of self-made entrepreneurial businesswoman. I want to think about those extraordinary exceptions, people like Joan of Arc. We have a peasant girl, a teenager, young, and a woman who redefines a national history, if you like. So they are there. But then there's also all these other women who have, in many ways, been hidden in plain sight. So in the book, one of the things I'm going to discuss with you today is religion and the role of women within religion. You might think that the Catholic Church in particular is one of the most patriarchal entities on the planet. But when we start to think about these early medieval women being unrecoverable, it's in the area of convents, double monasteries, the church, that they really are finding a voice and finding a way to have their names, their reputations, their impact recorded for posterity. The slide you can see here is from an encyclopedia. It was unfortunately lost during the Second World War, but a facsimile was made of it. And this was a large book that was made in a monastery not far from Hildegard of Bingen's monastery in the Rhineland in Germany. And I will take a little detour via Hildegard because she's kind of my hero. But this was actually by a group of nuns in a monastery about 20 kilometres away. And what you have in the frontispiece is essentially the editorial board of this encyclopedia. It's one of the earliest full surviving historical encyclopedias written in the 12th century, an attempt to kind of gather together world history alongside different kind of myths and legends and stories and scientific information. A huge enterprise. And what I love about this image is every single woman is different from the other. They've got their names there. And it's an all-female editorial board. And these are women who are being given an opportunity to learn, to read, to write, to create knowledge in a place that ultimately gets denied to women from the Reformation onwards. So when I was looking back through time and thinking, how did we end up where we are? How have we got to a modern world where my son has just turned 15, my daughter's just turned 13. When I had them a decade and a half ago, I was still leaning into the notion that I had to be mother, wife, and earner, and do all the things that I had been taught growing up that women had to do. And I have lent into those cliches, despite the fact I research in this area. Why have we ended up with this idea of the second sex? Where does it come from? And looking for the origin of the domestic sphere being the female sphere, I found that the phrase, a woman's place is in the home, was first used by John Calvin in 1509. And when I look deeper into the role of women within the Reformation, Martin Luther has a lot to say on the subject, but this is just a summary of one of his phrases. The wife should stay at home and look after the affairs of the household as one who has been deprived of the ability of administering those affairs that are outside and concern the state. And what I'm looking at in my next book is how state builders, nation builders of the 18th, 19th and 20th century enforce and really kind of put at the heart of nation building this notion of a difference between men and women and their roles in the private sphere and in the public sphere. And now I'm not saying that in the medieval world women had it good. There was a lot of misogyny. And Christine de Pizan is the perfect example. Almost her entire oeuvre is trying to get the deep-rooted misogyny in medieval culture to the fore, draw attention to it, discuss it. In an average sort of person's life, you would probably, as a woman, be married off to somebody, either within your community or somebody you didn't necessarily, that was of benefit to the family. Most people would have lived the life of peasants. I know we all think we're coming back as Cleopatra, but we're not. We'd probably all come back as people who are digging up potatoes. And in this world, there is definite inequality, founded, of course, on the very first section of Genesis where there is the difference between Adam and Eve. But what I wanted to draw attention to in Femina was there was this other area, this other world where women could excel. And these were in the convents, in the double monasteries. So there was this alternative area. And in some of these places, not all of them, we have to think about these monastic establishments being vibrant miniature cities. I'm sure, being up here in the north, you've gone over to Wearmouth, Jarrow, or been to Fountains, or been to Revo, seen how monasteries were set up, often on a river, and this river becomes an artery for raw materials coming in, and then there'll be workshops, noise, sounds are all along the site of the monastery where things are being made. Objects are then going back out, but ideas are coming in and out. People are coming in and out. These were not quiet, pious, very sanctified spaces. They were busy, industrious, wealthy, very often, large institutions. And in these spaces, women could, like Hildegard of Bingen, on occasion, reach the same levels of intellectual achievement as her male counterparts, and even in some cases exceed her male counterparts. So when the Reformation, when the monasteries are closed down and their lands taken, something happens, which is that the monks, the male religious that had been in these establishments, are either given a pension or they're given the opportunity to work within the new church framework. Church of England. So they're brought in as priests or given another position. But the female institutions are closed, and all of the nuns and religious women are told, now your place is in the home. And I think that, for me in my research, seemed like quite a stark realization that there was this moment. So, you know, we can unpack the different ways in which women have found themselves increasingly disenfranchised, increasingly moved out of politics, out of society, out of the realm of men, and that is one of the moments, I think, along that path. But I have come to you today to talk to you about early medieval women. A lot of what I'm talking about here is late Middle Ages and the impact in the sort of 14th, 15th century going forward. What if we zoom right back to 500, 600 AD? What is going on in terms of women in society at that point? Well, I think this is a good place to discuss it. As you can see from this rather fantastically old slide that still hasn't been bettered. I've been reeling this out for 20 years and this map still works. Oh, is that a pointer? Here you can see York, and you can see, you know, the move up the coast, Lindisfarne, and this sort of radial Celtic Christianity wrapping around this through Ireland. And when we think about the role of women in pre-Christian society, first off, we have Roman Britain. And as I'm sure you're all aware, and as the nation builders of the 19th century were definitely aware, in the classical world, in classical civilization of Greece and Rome, women are passive citizens. They are not active citizens. They have no vote. They have no independence from their male relatives. They are within those civilizations. They are definitely secondary citizens. And that would have been the case within Romano-Britain, where this sort of Roman veneer was placed on top of the British. And then things change. The Romans withdraw. And what happens? We get this influx of Anglo-Saxons and Jutes, Germanic people, who are filling the sort of political and diplomatic void, if you like, that's been left by the Roman administrators. This, again, is sort of a veneer on top of British people and Celtic people that had been there before. But the society that emerges is a warrior class. So this is where we get Beowulf, this is where we get the Sutton who treasures, this is where we get these ideas of bold, brave men with their reputations. I'll be showing you something from the Staffordshire Hoard in a moment. And I remember meeting the curator just after it was discovered, such an exciting time. And we had all the finds laid out, and the finds from the Staffordshire Hoard would have run to the back of this lecture theatre on 2 long trestle tables. That's how many artefacts came out of that one hoard in 2009. And he was looking through them and he said, the impression I keep getting looking at these objects is that the people wearing them were psychopathic peacocks. And I thought, that's perfect. He said, they'll look amazing while they chop your head off. And it was this sort of, he called it warrior bling, and he had all these amazing phrases for what we were looking at. But this is the world, I think, that we're dealing with around the year 500, going up to 600, this world where actually it is a very male-orientated world. It's a world where brawn and courage and reputation are central. If you've read Beowulf, you'll know there's just a single peripheral female character who sort of floats around handing the drinks about. And so that's not a particularly empowering environment for women. Then we get Christianity. And actually, this is the paradox, if you like, that what is an essentially patriarchal religion gives an opportunity to these early medieval women that they didn't have before. And that takes us to a landscape you'll recognise. I have worked closely on the individuals behind each of these foundations when they formed. So you know that Hexham and Ripon were formed under Bishop Wilfrid. He was very much modelling his type of monastic establishment on the examples that he'd seen across the Channel over in Gaul. those crypts, those fabulous crypts that you can still go into, that are sort of recreating the miraculous journey that you would have had going to St. Peter's in Rome. So very European-centred. If you went to Weymouth and Jarrow, home of the Venerable Bede, there it was also Romanocentric. They had their stone monastery coated in pink paint. I love the idea of this sort of pink building popping up amongst all the wooden buildings. And there it was all about education. It was about the creation of the Codex Amiatinus, the first complete single-bound copy that we have in existence. I like to think of Weymouth Jarrow as the sort of Silicon Valley of its day. All the great minds were being drawn there, and this sort of intellectual pursuits were taking place there. Lindisfarne, you can see I've put an example up there of the Lindisfarne Gospels, founded under the Celtic model. So different from the Roman model in lots of different ways. Summed up at the Synod of Whitby as about haircuts. One team liked the mullet, the other liked the donuts. But it was much more than that. It was about how people behaved within these environments. The Celtic form of Christianity about going out with a bell, a crook, a gospel book and drawing people to you, as opposed to the Roman monastic model, which was about these sorts of mini cities, mini armies of God, adhering to the Benedictine rules. So two very different worlds meeting in the north, in Lindisfarne. And just down here, Whitby. And it's Whitby that I landed on in my search for these unrecoverable early medieval women. Because of course it is at Whitby that we have Hild. Her very name, Hild, is the Old English for battler, battle. She is from the nobility of Northumbria. She is a product of this warrior elite. And symbolically, as Bede writes in his ecclesiastical history, it's symbolic, because the number 33 is the age, apparently, that we're all going to be regenerated as in heaven. So look forward to that. It's like Club 1833 in heaven all the time. That was the age that Jesus died at, and it's a symbolically important age. And in the book, he writes that Hilda has spent 33 years of her life in this world, the world of the warrior, and then she spends the last 33 years of her life in the world of the Christian saint. But why would she do this? She's already from the nobility. She's already wealthy, influential, important within her world. I'd argue that there were so many things that were attractive to women about Christianity. And we see this if we go back to late antiquity, if we go back to the early church fathers in Rome, right around the emergence of the Christian church, when it was just one cult among many. The people who tended to be the funders of the early church were women. St. Jerome writes many of his letters begging old widows to give all their money to him. And you look at those early church dedications, Santa Pudenziana in Rome, that was a gift by Pudenziana, a woman, to the church, of land, of property, of money. Women were drawn into Christianity, I think, because if you contrast it with state religions, the church in Rome, so the cult of the gods and goddesses of ancient Rome. It's such a hierarchical religion. Same in Athens, same in Egypt, same in any of the great civilizations. It's all about restricting access, isn't it? I don't know if anyone's been up to the Parthenon, but those stages of the ritual would mean that the populace could get to the lowermost stage. Then maybe the upper middle class could get to the next stage. Then maybe the nobility and the elite could get to the next stage. Maybe the emperor, the royal family, could get into the inner sanctum. And then the final bit was just for the priests, just for the elite. So these religions were about sort of keeping people out. And one of the big things Christianity has as its USP is everybody is part of the church, including the poor, including the disenfranchised, women. So I think that was an initial sort of big abstract concept for why it appealed. But let's look at what else Hilda would have got by becoming an abbess of this new concept from across the seas, this stone buildings, Latin language, a religion that promises eternal life if you can decode this book. This is a non-literate environment, the pre-Christian Anglo-Saxon England. Just, I think about that moment when Augustine must have got off that boat at Thanet with a cross in one hand and a book in the other. And of course, I'm going to talk about Bertha, I'm going to talk about Ethelbert, but to a general member of the Anglo-Saxon world, what is a book? What is that script in there? What is the language? How do I read it? And you're telling me if I can read that, I can go to heaven. Brilliant. So Hilda would have been open to this environment because of what she could have learned. And obviously the finds from Whitby reinforce that this is a vibrant intellectual community. We have styluses, we have engraved inscriptions in Latin. We have decadence. These beads and hairpins, they are all about the sort of luxury of this place. I particularly like the runic comb that was found. It has a prayer on it, and yet it's written not in the Latin alphabet, but in that proto-literate alphabet of runes. So it shows that bridge between these two worlds in this place. And I think the other thing that benefited these early founders of monasteries, this was a double monastery, remember, a male community and a female community living alongside one another with an abbess, Hilda, over all of them. And with these sorts of monastic institutions, women could inherit land, they could get land for themselves, they could manage that land, and they could also, at times, pass that land on. So what you tend to see is an abbess will pass on the abbacy to her daughter, or to a relative, or to a niece. So there are these familial connections. This is about the sort of empowerment of a woman being able to really take control of an area of the north of England and influence it. And we know she influenced it, don't we? Because I've already mentioned 664, the Synod of Whitby. Hilda does something that we haven't seen in the church until the last few decades, which is as a woman, she coordinates this synod, this important synod between the Celtic Church and the Roman Church. And I think that is quite astonishing that she reaches these heights. In my other book, I wrote about Bridget of Ireland, but of Kildare. And similarly, Bridget is roughly contemporary, a little bit after Hilda. But what's interesting about Bridget is she takes on the mantle of a pre-Christian goddess, the goddess Bridget, very popular Celtic goddess. And yet she also has incredible power within the church in Ireland, so much so that the only people that were above her were the archbishops. As abbess of Kildare, she had extraordinary power and influence. So these are the sorts of women I was looking for. And when I was thinking about this idea of them being unrecoverable, I thought, okay, well, I've read Bede's ecclesiastical history an unholy number of times. It's really not a healthy occupation, really. I should get more interests. But every time I read Bede, I tend to look for different things. So sometimes I'm looking for what he says about a particular individual. Sometimes I'm looking for a particular location. This time I thought, right, I'll read it with fresh eyes and I'll look for the women. Do you know what? There's a lot of them in there. A lot of them. He writes a lot about different female communities. He writes a lot about different female saints. He writes a lot about Hilda. He writes about how Hilda supports Caedmon, the poet. He writes about her role in the Synod of Whitby. He writes about her abbey at Strathshall. He is foregrounding these women in a way that I think he's not been read to be seen to be doing that. We tend to think Bede is writing, as indeed he is, a top-down history of conversion. Kings converting, nobles converting, and all of that sort of filtering down eventually. But there are women in that story. And one of the women I was particularly surprised to find he writes a good deal about is Bertha of Kent. And Bertha of Kent will come up in a bit. But first off, on this journey, I want to think, if I am struggling to find women in historical documents, why might that be? So this brings me back to the title of my book, Femina. As I'm sure you know, it's the Latin word for woman, but why did I choose that title? I was making a documentary on Julian of Norwich, my favourite documentary I made. I rode on a donkey, it was fantastic. I absolutely loved making that documentary, and as part of that, I went to, on the search for, it was called Search for the Lost Manuscript. The fact that Julian of Norwich in the 14th century wrote this book, The Revelations of Divine Love, which is a sublime but complex book. The fact that she wrote it, and in it she talks about God as mother, she talks about sin being necessary, behoviously. It's not unorthodox, but it's skirting towards the edges of what could be potentially questionable. And she writes this book from the position of being an anchorite, an anchoress, holed up in one room for 30 years. It's a very dramatic, obviously there's a wonderful example of an anchorite here in York, but what an anchorite would do would be that they would essentially sit through their own funeral before being walled up in a single room, not allowed to leave it on pain of excommunication. And we think Julian went into becoming an anchoress because she had been through the Black Death and lost family members. She had been through subsequent plagues, suffered, possibly lost children, husbands. And in that process of being extraordinarily sick, she had a sequence of visions. And these visions she records as her revelations. So she chooses to go into this cell. And I've had students say to me, my God, they were all mad in the medieval period, weren't they? Why would you want to be locked up in a room for the rest of your life? We've lived through a pandemic. I had a cat to see me through my pandemic. Julian had a cat. And she could write all day. It's not that bad. So she wrote this book. And yet, while it's inside this cell, it's okay. It's not, she's not going to be burnt alongside the many heretics that are being punished at this point in the 14th century. How does it get out of that room to us today? What happened? And in searching for this manuscript, my journey took me first up to the north, to a convent up there, then across to France. And it was in France that after the Reformation, Thomas More's children and grandchildren crossed over there and set up a convent for young women, all between the ages of 18 and 22. Again, kind of sounds fun. And here, they somehow got a copy of Julian's Revelations of Divine Love. And then they copied it, passed it down, secretly, quietly. And it passed from hand to hand, female convent to female convent, until it was eventually picked up in a collection in the British Library, listed under witchcraft and sorcery. And it was picked up by another woman, who then wrote it down, and it's never been out of print since then, since the 30s. But what is so extraordinary about Julian's text is it's just an indicator of the thousands and thousands of works by women that have been lost. Books, manuscripts, texts can be burnt, destroyed, they can be forgotten about, they can be classed as heretical, damaging. A book and the ideas within it is an incredibly vulnerable object. And what we end up with in collections is the result of generation after generation editing down what we inherit from texts of the past. And the reason my book is called Femina was because when I was searching for the manuscript, I found myself in a number of municipal libraries in little towns across France. And in these libraries, there's all manner of things, and they're very understaffed often, and they don't have full-time curators to work through the material. I turned up in one, quite close to where the Moors convent was. And what had happened after the French Revolution is as they dissolved all the monasteries and took all the material out of the libraries and out of the churches, they simply took them in crates to the local municipal library and left them there for storage. And some of these crates haven't been opened, haven't been gone through, and it was in one of these that the gentleman who they had brought in, a young man to curate this material, said, I found something interesting, do you want to see it? Yes, always. He said, I found the receipts, the holdings, library holdings of the monastic library and the municipal library over the course of a couple of centuries. And what this shows you is they start in sort of 1670, then they pick up again around 1740, and again around 1800. And it's boring in many ways. It's just like an Excel spreadsheet of books that are in the library. And as it goes on to the next one, you'll see lines going through books. And they've been scrubbed out. The names have been scrubbed out. And there'll be a little word next to this line that says why this book is no longer in the collection. Often it is heretical, witchcraft, unorthodox. And then there was one line through and it had Femina next to it, written by a woman. And because it was known to be written by a woman, it had been taken out of the collection. So I tend to think about women's survival in historical texts and in historical documents a little bit like a sort of Darwinian survival of the fittest. The stories that each generation tells the next generation are the ones that most serve the status quo. If you've got people that you need to send to war, give them stories about soldiers, about fighting, about battle. If you've got a colonial approach where you're going out and conquering the world, give them stories of explorers, of adventurers. Women fare pretty badly in that sort of rising to the surface of texts. People either don't want to read about them or they ignore them, and they certainly don't want to hear about them as strong, independent people challenging male contemporaries as you go through the 17th, 18th, 19th century. So Femina became the title, and because I realised quite quickly that things like Julian's revelation of divine love is an exception, things like Margery Kempe's book is an exception, they are accidental survivors, if you like, where else can I find women? We were always 50% plus of the global population. They must be there. Archaeology is our friend. And it was in search of context for Hilda that I turned my eyes to the archaeology of the north. Just down the coast from Whitby, you have this rather unattractive looking slide, which is showing you Hartlepool, Saltburn, and a site called Street House. So I'm now, with the last 10 minutes of my talk, going to take you to Street House. And this site is an extraordinary place. It's so unassuming today. It's just a farm on the edge of a cliff on the northern coast. But a team of archaeologists led by the wonderfully named Steve Sherlock, he is the detective of northern archaeology, have been excavating this site right the way through 70s, 80s, 90s, have been doing various digs around this site. They have found things like Teesside's oldest domestic dwelling. They have found a henge, evidence for a henge, that would have been a circle with passageways through it. Now, I'm good friends with Professor Alice Roberts, who is far more scientifically minded than I am and far more rational than I am. It's the medievalist in me. I see ritual and ceremony everywhere, whereas she tells me there's often a logical explanation. So when I was working with her on the star car headdresses, I don't know if you've seen these, they're sort of cut down antlers shaped into something you would wear on your head with a strap. I said, well, it's clearly ritual. Ooh, how exciting. And she said, no, it's probably just a coat hook. Kind of makes everything boring. I like the idea of ritual. So this henge that was found at Street House, it has processional routes. It's doing something on the landscape, but nobody really knows what. So Steve and his team called it the Wasset. What is it? So nobody knows what the Wasset is, but the Wasset's older than Stonehenge. So this site, we know, has got continuous use across the millennia. And when they started excavating this particular area, which is about the size of a football pitch, they were looking for what you can see here, which are these much larger impressions. Iron Age roundhouses. So there are clearly Iron Age buildings on this site. There are Roman stones, so there's Roman occupation on this site. Obviously, we can date it back earlier, going right back to the Neolithic. Why this place on the cliff, we don't know. But whatever is going on here, there is continuity of use. In the memory of this landscape, this site matters. And so when they were looking for the Iron Age finds, something else started to come to light. At first, they were a bit disappointed. Like, oh, it's medieval. We wanted earlier than that. But these graves that started to appear were clearly something special, because look at the way they're formed. They run around the site, which, as I say, is a very, very large site, and there are clear gaps in the arrangement of the burials. So if we're thinking about this as a large-scale cemetery site, there is a focal point within the cemetery site, which is this raised mound here, and evidence for a couple of wooden buildings, and then a focal point of these 3 burials here, and then a passageway out. Now, I know you're thinking, here she goes with her ritual and ceremony and processions, but look, it's logical. You would process through this space, I think. What else is significant? The direction of the burials. The burials are orientated east-west. Now, that is a Christian development. It's going right back to, I mean, you can see it with the orientation of churches as well, the idea of the passage of the sun, and that Christian burials will be orientated east-west. So, are we looking at a Christian burial? In which case, we have to be looking at after St. Augustine in 597. This must be 7th century, 8th century, it has to be. But then other things started to appear. So I just want to draw your attention to this lovely reconstruction, almost a photograph. It's like we were there. But you can see the buildings. You can see that these particular mounds here are sort of high-status burial mounds. But what tends to happen with Christian burials, of course, is because they're in pre-Christian societies, there's the assumption that in the afterlife you need to take goods with you. We think about the pharaohs. I've just been in Egypt, and this idea that you need all the stuff that they needed, beds and food and all the rest of it. The Anglo-Saxons did that too, of course. And in their large burial mounds, like at Sutton Hoo, we see a hall in miniature, cauldrons and tapestries and anything you might want and need. So burial with grave goods is a pre-Christian concept. When Christianity arrives, the idea is you're buried east-west and you're just in a simple shroud. There should be no goods going into the ground with you. But that's what makes this cemetery tricky, because they are clearly Christian burials, but they have grave goods. And the grave goods are really something. So this individual has been termed the Loftus Princess. And as you can see in this, this isn't what she came out of the ground looking like, by the way. Hasten to add. This is a reconstruction. In fact, the soil is incredibly acidic and has destroyed most of the bone evidence, which is why it's difficult to do DNA analysis. So we are going, on this case, on grave goods as an indicator of sex, which is incredibly problematic, and chapter 2 in my book. But for the time being, we are going to say that this individual was buried with these items that are incredibly high status. So look around her neck. These are her necklace. This is her necklace. Utterly unique. In terms of the technique and the style of this piece, very traditional. It's exactly what we see with other pre-Christian Anglo-Saxon metalwork. Gold and garnet. How that just continues down the centuries as the fashion statement of the warrior elite. But the gold and garnet here something else has been done with this. First off, can you see that the cells are slightly irregular? So some of them are slightly larger than others, and they're ever so slightly off-center. That's because the cloisons, the gems, the garnets here, have been taken over from an older object. Now, we can only speculate what that object might have been. It could have been something like what we find at Staffordshire Hoard, a sword hilt or a brooch that belonged to an ancestor. But the owner of this necklace has reused it. I don't know if any of you have ever inherited a piece of jewellery and then had it modified to kind of be more up to date with your tastes. That's what I think is going on here. And what has this person done? They've had something very large and very distinctive put in the middle of this pendant, a shell. Anybody been on or know about the Santiago de Compostela? Yeah? What's the symbol all the way along? The shell. And the shell, again, has an ancient symbolism. It goes back to Aphrodite, the idea of this virgin birth, essentially, coming out of the sea on a shell, and about being new life. New life is what the shell represents in the classical tradition. In early Christianity, they take this symbolism over and they turn it into a symbol for resurrection, new life in resurrection. So you'll find shells over the heads of martyrs and saints to show that they are resurrected. So the shell is a Christian symbol. And to have this shell prominently around their neck I think is an indicator to people around this woman that she is dabbling with this new religion. And look at the decoration of the pendants around it. These are cabochon garnets. Very similar in style. Hang on, I have to, sorry. Don't look at those for a second. To the pieces that were worn on the continent at this point. This is the Empress Theodora. She is being depicted here in Ravenna. And that jewellery of the 6th century, 7th century, late antique women is what I think she's trying to emulate in Loftus with these cabochon garnets. So we have this woman buried up on the coast in the north. Her grave is the centre of this massive cemetery. There are these huts, these buildings next to her grave where they used to display her for people to come to the funeral. Was one a chapel, perhaps? And yet they're being buried with these objects that literally a generation earlier were adorning warriors that were pagans that believed in Thor and Freya and Odin, not this Jesus chap. And the finds, I mean, I'm putting these other examples up just to highlight the nature of these objects in terms of how similar they are aesthetically to these earlier finds. These are from the Staffordshire hoard. This, of course, the shoulder clasp from the Sutton Hoo treasures, that burial ground of kings, as Martin Carver called it, where the golden garnets here, I mean, they are exquisite, but this is blown up. The object itself is this big. Can you see in each of these little cloisons that where the gold has been bent and the garnet has been nibbled, so that having been in the ground in an acid bath for 1,400 years, none of these garnets have fallen out. No adhesive, no glue, pressure of the gem against gem. And behind each slither of garnet, which is a very hard gemstone to work, they've put something in. I don't know if you can make it out. Can you see? There's like a checkerboard effect behind the garnet. This is a feather-thin piece of gold that has been stamped with a checkerboard effect and placed behind the gem, so that when the sunlight goes through the gemstone, it hits the gold plate at the back, fractures and sparkles back out. So it turns what's otherwise a very dull, dark gemstone garnet into something glistening. But if you look closely, each of those cells there are less than a centimetre. And inside you can see a checkerboard. Each of those checkerboards are less than 0.8 of a millimetre. Inside each of those squares is another checkerboard. And this is the point where my students go, oh, it was the aliens. But it does make you wonder. No running water, no electricity. These things would have been worked out in the elements with very basic tools. Any craftspeople's tools that we found from this period are quite simple. So what is going on? I must wind up because I know I have to go to questions. But with all these things in my mind, I wanted to think about this woman, this Loftus woman, who she was. Why was she here? Why was her community treating her with such reverence, such dignity? Why does she have this object with her in her grave? And what I saw with her was a woman who has 1 foot in the past and 1 foot in the future. Buried alongside her was another woman. And the other woman had this around her neck. And what we have here are reused Roman beads. And on either side of this individual's necklace, 2 Celtic coins. And what's magic about these coins is the way that they were laid out in the grave as the individual was prone. The face of the coins that was looking out were 2 horses. You can see the 2 horses. They're abstract, but you might be able to make them out. And the way the horses were positioned was it made it look like they were running, almost animated, you know? But on the reverse of these coins were 2 crosses. So have we got a sort of amateur archaeologist who's been looking around the countryside at Street House, found these hundreds of years old coins, thought, they're nice, they're antiques, I'll have those. And it's about the echoes of this landscape. The fact that this person has been buried alongside Iron Age roundhouses, alongside Roman stones and Neolithic structures, with these antique objects, reused golden garnet, Celtic coins and Roman stones, they are showing a respect for where they've come from. But at the same time, by being buried east-west and being buried in a way with this Christian symbol of the shell around her neck, she's also anticipating what's just around the corner. And as we've got Hilda just up the road in Whitby, you'll have noticed from that slide earlier, Hartlepool, powerful site for monastic evidence of women's communities. So I think we could see this individual perhaps as part of this bubbling new conversion period. And that's why this burial is known as a final phase burial, final phase of the pagan burial with grave goods going into Christian burials. I was going to mention more about Bertha of Kent and the fact that when we've looked for women in the text, we find Hilda, we find Bertha, we find the women of Hartlepool, we find these other people if we look for them. And also, there's some evidence right there in Bede, which made me want to look at this necklace with fresh eyes. Because when Bede records the dream that Hilda's mother had when she was pregnant with Hilda, listen how he describes her. She found a most precious necklace under her garment. And while she was looking on it very attentively, it seemed to shine forth with such a blaze of light that it filled all Britain with the glory of its brilliance. This dream was doubtless fulfilled in her daughter that we speak of, whose life was an example of the works of light, not only blessed herself, but to many who desired to live aright. Hilda is being connected to a necklace. We have a necklace in the Loftus bed. Something else that I didn't mention, just let it in there, is one characteristic of these final phase burials is that they're largely centered around a high-status woman, and that woman is buried in a bed. I've already put my order in. I'm having a bed for eternity. But these final phase bed burials with women at them are really coming to light more. So just recently, this discovery was made. This is the Hartlepool treasure. It is still in this state. So parts of the treasure haven't even been fully excavated. They've been taken in the soil and x-rayed. But from this x-ray, we can see that there is something extraordinary underneath this soil that is going to come to light. Gold, it looks like, but look at the arrangement of it. And then elsewhere found in this burial, this necklace. Look, all the things we were talking about. Look at the cabochons. And here, instead of a shell, you've still got gold and garnet, but in the shape of a cross. And this is just one of these final phase burials, because other ones coming to light, this is a reconstruction of how she may have been buried. See the similarity with Loftus. We've had these other ones, the Ixworth cross. Look, gold and garnet, but done in the shape of a cross. There is something happening at the turn around the year 600, in the north of England in particular, where women are selecting to engage with this new religion from the continent. They are seeing opportunities offered by it, and we know that they are setting up monastic organisations, that they are leaning into the church, if you like. So are they unrecoverable? I think there's still work to be done, but hopefully I've shown you we can find them if we look in different ways. Thank you very much. Sorry, I know I've run out of time, but I hope I can take a few questions. I'm terrible. I always do this.
Well, I didn't want to interrupt because it was so fascinating. Thank you so much, Janina. We have time, I think, for 2 or 3 questions, hopefully.
Oh, there's
we have some
very
enthusiastic questioners at the back.
Well waved.
Yes.
Thank you very much. I practiced. So my question is mostly around the grave goods that you were talking about. I know that in other Anglo-Saxon burials, they've found Neolithic arrowheads, Neolithic things, and some of them have been turned into necklaces and such. Yeah. So clearly there's some kind of reverence going on around the past in Anglo-Saxon history, where they're picking up coins and they're turning them into jewelry and they're making something of them. I have been unable to find anything written about that, and not in terms of like contemporary now, obviously people write about it, but their reasoning back then. And I'm wondering if you know of anything where they write about their reasoning for picking up these Neolithic older stone axes.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's something that I don't think has been studied enough, and in the bibliography of my book, I've put in all the articles I was able to come across in terms of why this might be happening. I think it's part of a pattern that we see on the continent as well. When we think about relics, for example, often you'll have intaglios reused, you'll have bits of glass, bits of material that are old already by the time they're being brought into these objects. I think in terms of Street House, it's quite interesting because the landscape itself, it's quite a contained site, and yet you have these very obvious layers of use over more than 1,000 years. And in that case, I think that the fact they're being buried there with these ancient artefacts on them is part of that story of memory, of memorialization. I think in terms of the use of older Neolithic pieces, for example, they're looking for something beautiful. It's no different to us going to an antique shop today and saying, oh gosh, isn't that Victorian brooch beautiful? They're finding beauty in objects, and these things are in the ground. I mean, we think of archaeology as a young discipline, but scavenging and finding these things goes right back to across time. And having just been in Egypt as well, thinking about tomb robbers, grave robbers, think about Sutton Hoo, the fact that that only survived because the grave robbers missed it by inches. The idea that people are finding old objects in the ground and are fascinated by them, I think, carries on right the way through time.
Right. My question is, I'm trying to word it so that it makes sense. At the very beginning, you mentioned that the church and the convents, specifically for women in Christian church, specifically, were very important places for the development of women in society and everything. And as soon as you said that, I thought about Catherine of Siena and how she managed to actually talk to the Pope and actually advise the Pope, and the Pope actually listened to her. If I'd have managed
to finish my presentation, you'd have got Catherine.
There you go. So as soon as you mentioned that, I thought about the first time I heard about her story, and I immediately thought about my first thought, that was, how did she manage? As in, she was a woman in a convent, she was illiterate. How did she manage to get to talk to the Pope and basically get that high in society? So my question is, how, and then, sorry, just to put it in context, then you mentioned how this happened throughout history for women specifically in church, and then you mentioned Hilda and all of the others. I'm like, how did that happen? Was it just because men were too focused on other things happening in society that this just happened? Because historically they're very good at stopping women from empowering themselves, of course. So I'm like, how did this happen?
Catherine I put up because she's in the next book, and the Beguines are in the next book, and Bridget Sweden's in the next book, and Hildegard of Bingen was in Femina. But this is the thing, once you start to look, I mean, I know working in high medieval and late medieval that you do as well, they're there in the archives, and they're there in these communities, influencing the world they're a part of. I mean, Hildegard of Bingen, the phrase I use is she's Leonardo da Vinci, centuries before Leonardo da Vinci, and better than Leonardo da Vinci, because she finished her project. She got stuff done. And she lived to the age of 81. She was a polymath, a musician, a linguist, a scientist, an artist, a playwright. You know, she was absolutely extraordinary. But the point I make in the book, I'm very clear about this, when I work on women in history, I don't see this as binaries. I don't see this as a man's world and a woman's world. The reason Hildegard, Catherine, Bridget, the reason they reach the heights they reach is because they are part of complex societies where both men and women are building each other up. And if we are going to be demonizing the men of the past, these women wouldn't have had the careers they had without the support of popes, of bishops, of kings, of emperors. And so I like finding these extraordinary women, not because they are exceptions, not 50 women from history you should know about and here's a page on them and let's move on, but because they become windows onto much more complex societies than I think we imagine, where women are being given these opportunities. Yes, they are thin and far between, but they're there. And that, I think, creates a much richer tapestry of looking at the past than how we've maybe been conventionally taught to engage with it.
I think that is a very inspiring note on which to end. In which case, I want to very, very warmly thank you, Nina, for such an interesting talk. I'm sure, I'm sure you, like me, are just buzzing with ideas. Fortunately, Janina will be outside signing copies.
Can I just
of
say as
her
well,
book.
thank you for putting up with me, because I know I'm not 100% well yet, and you've all been such a lovely, enthusiastic, smiling audience, so thank you. And thank you for the wonderful chairing.
Yes, and Janina will be out signing copies of her book, Femina. Please do stop by our independent bookseller partner, Fox Lane Books, and get your own copy to delve into so many of these rich issues. Thank you so much, Janina, for a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
We could all do a round of applause.